Well, thank you so much for having me here. Yeah, so to me, of course, it doesn't feel like I have been founding anything. Well, I helped set up some organizations, but I'm also been hanging around at a lot of meetings with interesting people or on mailing lists with interesting people. And if you keep on doing that for a few decades, eventually you become so integrated with the whole movement or social scene that you might actually claim to know a little bit about it. So my background is very much interested in everything. Already as a little kid, I wanted to become a scientist, mostly because I read a lot of science fiction stories, and I got the impression that scientists were out there having adventures with dinosaurs and ray guns. Now, as an academic, I notice a certain lack of dinosaurs in my work. But of course, that process was all started by reading a lot of science fiction and then trying to make that science fiction real. And that is probably a background that's fairly common among many transhumanists. So in this talk, which is going to be somewhat wide-ranging, and I'm very happy to be interrupted and go down various rabbit holes, I'm going to try to think about the pathways people take to and through transhumanism. So generally, of course, even defining transhumanism is hopeless, because typically you find that people come from rather different areas. You have a very big hazy set of overlapping narratives, social networks, etc. Some of them have relatively well written up rationales, others just exist for various reasons. And typically this means that when I'm trying to defend transhumanism from critics, I have this problem that I need to say, yeah, your criticism is totally valid against those guys, but doesn't apply to those guys, and I have a third opinion. So even doing a proper definition of transhumanism will always be somewhat fraught. So you can start out by saying, well, actually it's about questioning the human condition, saying that the human condition is not given, it might be changing, and we should question it, and in some places use rational means to improve it. So in some sense you could argue that this is partially a continuation of Renaissance humanism. I like bringing up Pico della Mirandola's concept in Oration of the Dignity of Man, which is an interesting document because while we quite often bring it up and say that's the opening of humanism, we tend to forget that it's mostly a defense of Christians doing alchemy and Kabbalah. Because they were kind of a new thing there, the nanotechnology of the 1500s, and some people were really concerned that maybe this is not something Christians can do. And Mirandola was kind of trying to defend this by his concept that, well, God didn't give us a fixed nature. The unique thing about human nature is that we can deliberately reshape ourselves, which of course gives us a tremendous responsibility to not become beastly, but we have an opportunity to become more angelic. And that is the part that, of course, then later on became much more important for humanism. Transhumanism is kind of taking that a little bit more literally, but actually we could change a lot of aspects of ourselves. We could include animal genes if we want to. The question is, what are good motivations for that? And that, of course, gets me to one of the interesting embarrassments of transhumanism. Transhumanism, in the wide sense, doesn't have a value theory. And this is actually one of the strongest arguments against claiming transhumanism is yet another religion. You can certainly make a religious transhumanism. There are Christian transhumanists. The Mormon transhumanist organization is big and vital. But you could put in other value theories. There is quite a lot of utilitarian transhumanists and consequentialist transhumanists. But you can make liberal transhumanists or come up with all forms of combinations. That, of course, is a reason for why you get so many transhumanisms. You can't actually pin it down because whatever applies to the Mormon transhumanists is probably not going to work on the Buddhist transhumanists. At the same time, you can approach it in a different way, like Nick Bostrom did in his excellent little essay about posthumanism, where he pointed out that the core value that anyway is underlying this is that we might want to explore the post-human realm. I think he's here looking at the concept of transhumanism that is kind of looking relatively far ahead. There is a lot of people who are transhumanists in the sense that they want to age more slowly. They want to be healthy. They want to be a bit smarter and have nifty gadgets and maybe be able to fly. in the grandest visions, they might imagine themselves as some kind of Greek god. So now you can fly around and eat ambrosia on the technological Mount Olympus. But it's still very much a projection of very near-term and traditional human interests. Nick's idea, however, is that there is a much bigger set of possibilities out there than the ways we have been currently existing. And those modes of being, some of them might be very valuable. If we just imagine this kind of landscape of modes and states of being, there are some amazing peaks within the small domain of human life. And maybe there are similarly high or even higher peaks outside. And in order to figure that out, we actually need to go exploring. It's probably not something we can figure out a priori. We can't just figure out that there must be a great state over there. Given how confused we are already about our own human lives, this means that we might actually need to do empirical research. And that exploration, according to Nick, is what is actually underlying a lot of transhumanism. Then, of course, you can also say, well, actually, we can look at it as a historical movement of ideas, and you can find different strands. So we have Enlightenment thinking leading over to the Industrial Revolution. You have people like H.G. Wells, who combines a bit of Enlightenment optimism with a bit of socialism, but also a bit of Darwinism, and realizes, oh, we humans are a species among others. We are likely to evolve in the future. So he has H.G. Wells has a very early story in the Pall Mall Gazette, where he's talking about man in the year million, where he's kind of doing this crude extrapolation of what he thinks the selection pressures are going to be. So he ends up with these big-brained creatures with very atrophied bodies, but big hands to manipulate technology, sitting in pools of nutrient fluid and being very brainy. So that's actually where you get this cliche in science fiction from. H.G. Wells came up with this before he even wrote The Time Machine, which is taking a slightly more literary tack on it. But you also got this thinking coming into an academic discourse. So again, Haldane's Daedalus, I think, is a really interesting example. So he gave his talk about the future of biotechnology, essentially, back in 1925, I think. And he points out that right now the physicists seem to be riding high. They are actually finding important things. That Einstein guy seems to have found some very important things, and those quantum guys seem to be on the verge of discovering something. So this century is probably going to be run by physics, basically. And he was pretty right about that. But he also pointed out that we are figuring out heredity. We're figuring out ways of modifying life itself. That might take a longer time, but his guess was that the 21st century would be the century of biology. And then he started talking also in a really interesting way about how humans would react to that. And he pointed out that the most likely reaction is, of course, total revulsion. Because when a physicist comes up with something new, typically somebody will say, that's kind of blasphemous. You're angering the gods by controlling lightning. But when you do a biological innovation, that's perversion, that's disgusting. And then he started pointing out, of course, that what typically happens is that we first get disgusted, then we get used to it, and then we build a religion around it. So he was bringing up drinking milk as an example. When you think about it, drinking milk from cows, that's weird and yucky. Yet, as he points out, now the cow is sacred in Hinduism. It becomes so integrated in our way of life that we can't actually, at least if we were Hindus, couldn't imagine it without that. So he argued there that we might actually end up in a future that's fundamentally biotechnological, that's going to both involve modifying the environment but also humans, and that we are going to have some built religions around that. It's a very interesting reading. He's even kind of offhandedly discussing problems like accidental releases of modified organisms that change the environment, like turning the oceans purple, and how people after a while get totally used to that and think that, oh, it's so weird looking at old paintings with blue oceans. Anyway, that led to a little burst of interesting writing in England in the 20s and 30s. So you got Bernal, who wrote The World, the Flesh, the Devil, which is kind of a socialist take on it, and a really early look at both, can you build the post-scarcity societies, where is automation heading, but also bringing up things like cyborgs. He was thinking that we can replace organs with artificial organs, and that's of course especially useful for going to space. So he has various sections where he's describing space habitats and essentially humans adapting to become something post-human in space. And this was, of course, taken up by Olaf Stapledon, the science fiction author, who in Last and First Men and Star Maker, these two very grand novels, which are in many ways the driest novels ever written, because they're more like long lectures than actual novels. The protagonist in the first one is kind of humanity in a very wide sense, all 14 or 18 versions of humanity stretching over billions of years of history. And in the second novel, basically it's intelligent life in this universe and all other universes. So in terms of protagonists, it's pretty abstract. They're also crammed with ideas, and it's amazing that this was kind of something people came up with in the 1930s. But that strand, while it influenced a lot of science fiction and then later influenced the transhumanist movement, was just one of many strands. There is another one which is slightly more obscure but equally fascinating in Russia, where you have the cosmists. So you have Nikolai Theodore, who was a librarian, and he was very influenced both by his Slavophilic Orthodox faith and the science he was reading. So he was considering that, what should we do here? It's pretty clear that God wants us to make the world better. God could obviously do that just with a virtual snap of his fingers, but that's a bit like a child asking parents to clean up the room. The parents will not be happy. The parents will be happy if the children actually realize that they should clean up the room. So we need a grand common task to avoid having wars and conflicts. And what's the most obvious task that everybody can get behind? Obviously, stopping aging and death. That's totally obvious, according to Fyodorov. And then he argued that this could unite mankind, get rid of wars. Before we reach that level, of course, we might start out by learning how to control the weather to avoid famines. That could be useful. But once we get onto this fundamental task of first slowing aging, then stopping aging, and then resurrecting the dead. And again, he had a religious rationale for this, which was kind of interesting, because he was arguing that, well, it's not just that we have duties to our offspring, of course. We have filial duties to our parents. And all the people we're descended from, we wouldn't be here without them. So we really ought to resurrect them. That's what God wants us to do. Of course, in order to do this, we also need to go to space. So this is kind of a really interesting set of ideas that comes up there in the late 1800 Russia. He was a good friend with Dostoevsky and Tolstoy. They had some interesting interchanges. And one of his interns, Tsiolkovsky, became school teacher and wrote some proto-science fiction as well as some technical writing about how to actually do spaceflight. So he's regarded very much as the father of actual spaceflight. He came up with the rocket equation, understood the need for stages, artificial gravity by rotating space stations, etc. And he influenced, of course, other people through his writings, including Sergei Korolev, who became an engineer in the Red Army and convinced the army that rockets are really useful, military speaking, and really big rockets and missiles, and why not spacecraft? And he became the great engineer of the Soviet space program. And of course, he was very much the teacher for Yuri Gagarin. So you have 4 steps here, from a slightly odd librarian thinking about religion to the first Soviet man in space. Of course, across these steps, the religious rationale for doing this kind of seamlessly disappeared and got replaced by a manifest destiny for the socialist republics, which really shows that quite often underlying values can be exchanged with almost frightening ease. So that is kind of my loose background of some of the early antecedents. And what typically happened is that transhumanist ideas have been around in our culture in a lot of ways, but you can arrange them in different ways. So in the 60s and 70s, you find Timothy Leary and the other psychedelic pioneers who were, of course, interested in expanding consciousness. But Timothy Leary was also explicitly saying that, oh yes, we have this program, SMILE, space migration, intelligence increase, life extension. He believed that psychedelics could help with that. But mostly because if you could free your minds using psychedelics, you would both realize that these goals were worthwhile, and of course now you would become so much of a better scientist that you could probably figure out how to do the life extension part. So you have this interesting interplay between what we normally we tend to say that, oh yes, the hippies were kind of anti-technology back to Earth, which is true for some of them. But some of them were also very much pro-space and were actually very strongly thinking that, oh, we need to support Gerald O'Neill's work at NASA about building these rotating space habitats, which incidentally, a certain Jeff Bezos is kind of, essentially he's been dusting off the old plans and trying to do it again. I don't know what Jeff Bezos did in the 60s, maybe we should check. But you have this interesting social movement, and of course California had been very much a nexus of that. So it's again not an entire coincidence that you also get the personal computer revolution coming from Silicon Valley, together with a lot of these other ideas. Many people developing laptops were actually thinking of them as an actual way of empowering people. Already the idea about a windowing system and a user interface came from earlier work by Vannevar Bush and Licklider and Engelbart that were explicitly framing this as augmenting human condition. This is something that could expand the ability to think. And then the 60s and 70s take on that was, and this power should not just be handled by people in white lab coats in the data center run by the military industrial complex. We need to put this in the hand of a citizen and empower them. So it's from this background that you get more of a modern transhumanist movement, where you get both the cryonics organizations thinking that, well, maybe we can preserve life by freezing people. You have a space movement overlapping with the personal empowerment movement. And of course, the borders here between the people who are taking a fairly mystical view and the people who are doing a hardcore practical engineering view are surprisingly blurred. So these days, I'm heading over to the Bay Area, and tomorrow I'm going to be hanging out with people involved in the Partnership for AI, which is an industry consortium trying to make safe artificial intelligence and handling that. But at the same time, I'm going to be meeting people who are interested in preserving brains for the future and scanning into computers the day we can actually do that. And I have various friends who are working on everything from very psychedelic things to the search for extraterrestrial intelligence. So that is kind of a background, a broad background here. So generally, it's kind of transhumanism is very wide, very diffuse, a lot of very different values. But I think one can sum it up by saying that it assumes that the future could be radically different from the present. And that also leads to another interesting thing. Some transhumanists get very pessimistic from this, because if the future could be radically better, it could probably be radically worse. If we think that the future is basically like the present, but with a bit more flying cars and the pollution, in that case, it's not that bad. We might want to have more flying cars and less pollution, but it can't go really badly wrong. If you think that you could get a technological singularity, then you could probably have something like a technological anti-singularity. So this is actually a reason why existential risk as a concept partially emerged inside the transhumanist movement. Thinking about the mankind going extinct certainly have existed long before that. All cultures have been having apocalypses because they give a nice, meaningful shape to history. What happened in the scientific revolution was, of course, that we realized, we could actually have one for real in a more objective sense, because we're seeing comets moving around and craters on other planets. Continents seem to have changed, species have gone extinct. We could be next. And indeed, the physicists showing up with thermodynamics after watching steam engines enough, we're starting to talk about the heat death of the universe. That kind of awareness of existential risk existed, but it was mostly worth writing in popular science stories or for H.G. Wells to use in his novels. In 1945, of course, it changed because of the nuclear weapons. Suddenly, it was very clear that, we humans might actually be causing our own extinction. And to both the Cold War and the environmental movement made risks to human survival a part of the discourse. However, it was not that much a part of the discourse except for these standard questions. So you would be talking about the risk of nuclear war. You would be talking about the risk of environmental devastation, but not thinking of, could there be other risks? So what happens in the late 90s, early 90s, is that the transhumanists are starting to take this very seriously. Nick Bostrom's paper that coins the term existential risk for human extinction risk becomes the seed for serious research into this as a cohesive field. And that has led to the emergence of a fair number of transhumanists who spend most of the time actually working on ways of preventing the world from going bad. rather than looking at ways of trying to maximize the world. Because the general view is that, yeah, there's probably a pretty good probability that things get nice if we survive and if we make the right tools for coordinating ourselves. But that is going to require a concerted effort. Of course, here you also get these interesting conflicts inside transhumanism between optimists like Ray Kurzweil, who is basically a technological determinist and think that all the curves are pointing upwards exponentially. Haha, everything is fine. How do you make safe artificial intelligence? Oh, teach it the golden rule. That's hard enough to teach to human kids. How do you teach that to a data center? So he is taking this relatively optimistic view, and I know transhumanists who really want that optimism because you need to have something to look forward to. I have a friend who regards herself as one of those little old ladies going to church every Sunday, and she listens to podcasts with Ray Kurzweil, and he's like the vicar telling about how it's going to be all lovely. And she doesn't want to hear my work stuff about how things could go really badly wrong. She just wants me to fix that so she can listen to Ray. And of course, I have other friends who are also really annoyed by some of the publications we produce, where we point out that actually racing ahead on some of these technology might be a very bad choice because that could be risky unless we develop safeguards before it happens. So many of them are a bit more like, no, let's just rush here. And this, of course, gets to an interesting internal challenge, because life extension, I would really like life extension because I'm getting older. So for me, it would be a really good thing if we took a lot of risks and shortcuts to get to life extension as early as possible. On the other hand, for mankind, maybe that's not the right thing. In terms of getting all sorts of glorious technologies, maybe it's a good thing to get them later, even though that means that a lot of present people will actually not get the benefits. So it might be, on the whole, wiser to slow down and be more careful about some technologies. But on an individual level, of course, I wanted to have a friendly, super intelligent AI with all the nanotechnology and life extension, so I can benefit from it. So that leads to this interesting conflict between taking a more personal perspective. Do I want to enhance my life? Versus the more impersonal perspective. Is this a story about where mankind is going? Now, the interesting thing is, of course, that personal perspective, many people who interview me want to hear, what do you do to enhance yourself, Anders? And they get very annoyed when it turns out that I'm not doing that radical stuff. They had kind of hoping that I would be pouring up a big pile of weird pills I'm taking every morning in order to prolong my life, and that I would be wearing some crazy, weird wearable computer. But most of the time I don't. I built myself a wearable computer in the 90s. I have some old photos where I look very amusing, like a very extra from a Star Trek ripoff. And it's of course way less powerful than my smartphone is today. In fact, my smartphone can do profoundly better things than that wearable computer thing I made. I couldn't even imagine that. In some sense, the smartphone has superseded my transhumanist vision from the 90s, and it didn't do that because there was a lot of transhumanists advising Apple and the others, although they probably exist somewhere in the background. It's rather that, yeah, there's a lot of practical technology there. Similarly, when it comes to life extension, it turns out that most nutrient supplements, the evidence for them actually working is rather weak. So unless you take them to get a lovely placebo effect, which can always be nice, it doesn't seem to be that scientifically rational to do. I'm taking metformin because I actually do think that has sufficient scientific data behind itself, and I'm old enough that it actually becomes valuable. But still, that's not that much. Similarly, when it comes to enhancer drugs, I actually deliberately tried all the cognitive enhancers I could get hold of, so I know what I was writing about when writing about the ethics of cognitive enhancement, including, of course, writing an essay about the ethics of ethicists taking the stuff they're supposed to write about the ethics of. It's an interesting question about how that lived experience matters or not. And some people would say you might become biased by trying that. But then again, we have philosophers writing about parenthood who are parents. Would we say that we can't trust them because they're parents, they're totally biased? We should only listen to childless philosophers. That seems to be missing the point. Actually, it's better probably to have both kinds, both the parents, because they actually do have quite a lot of insight, and occasionally one of the bachelor philosophers pointing out when they're totally fooling themselves. What you really want is, of course, to get interesting, good arguments anchored in something that you then can from the outside inspect. This might get tricky if you think about a pharmacologist trying cognitive enhancement, because maybe they get biased. If they think it's good enough that they want to take that drug, maybe they have already fooled themselves into that it is. We want a very objective result from the pharmacologist, and it's easy enough to fudge your pharmacological tests accidentally that we might want to be careful. In the case of ethicists, we will anywhere tear into their arguments because, nobody will ever let an ethical argument stand. Even if you agree with it, you will find some interesting point to disagree with. But it's an interesting issue of how much you apply transhumanism in your everyday life as a transhumanist. And I quite often notice when I encounter young transhumanists, typically late teenage, early 20 men who come across transhumanism and realize, now as a student I can actually pursue this. And they start eating soylent instead of food because it's so much more efficient. And they try polyphasic sleep because that would be so much more efficient. And they are essentially trying to control all aspects of their life. And typically this lasts for about 2 weeks. It's quite interesting. Sorry.
Oh, I just said it's a lot of work.
Yeah, it is. Controlling stuff is tremendous work, and especially if you're trying to do it all on the same time. I partially think it's very useful to try it. I think a person who doesn't try to find the limits, to try to push things when they're a teenager or in the 20s, they're missing out on something very important. And if you get new technology, you should be, of course, trying to do it with those too. The problem is many of these are doing it in a very unwise fashion. We're trying it all at the same time. So besides getting this weird sleep rhythm where they're active all around the day, except that they have to sleep whenever their little app tells them to, they're also eating this weird nutrient goop, and they're also trying to use various teaching systems that randomly flash up information that they're supposed to respond to. And then they wonder why they get headaches and feel not so optimal. So it's very fun to read the blogs people start writing when they try polyphasic sleep, because they only run for about 2 weeks, and then they actually realize that the gravity of a surrounding society is pretty big. You actually want to have friends who are following a normal diurnal rhythm. You might actually want to have dinner with them. It only works or retaining this kind of weird free-floating form if you happen to have a job or a position that actually doesn't involve many other people. I know some people who have got extremely weird sleep schedules, and they're typical philosophers working alone. It works for that. But even then, as soon as you get a more bigger position, you need to have meetings with people. And before you know it, you get dragged in with the rest of the world. And of course, the sensible people actually realize that that's actually not too bad. Because we actually gain quite a bit in our relationships. It's one thing to optimize your own performance, but that is typically relative to goals that you actually want to have with your surrounding world. So I typically appreciate it when people grow out of this. I certainly did it myself. I did a lot of crazy experiments, and I'm very happy I did, but these days I'm not trying to memorize all numbers I see. I'm using some memory tricks to remember my grocery list. That's super useful. I sometimes use various forms of memory art to memorize speeches. That's really enjoyable, especially since I know there are links to Renaissance philosophy and how memory art played a role in formulating the ideas leading to the World Wide Web, etc. But I'm not really trying to optimize everything. That optimization mindset is interesting and it's powerful, but it doesn't lead that far. So when I start looking for flourishing transhumanists, it's quite interesting to look at the older transhumanists who kind of learned the lessons. So for example, Natasha Vita-Moore, who is, among other things, co-editor of that book, she's an old friend. And she did a lot of great art in the 90s and so on. But a lot of that was this aspiration to this perfected future. And then, of course, as she grows older and grow up, and she also needs to deal with the fact that, now I'm an older transhumanist. Of course, you need to find a way of handling that. And that has actually deepened, in my opinion, her work quite a bit, because you need to find a way of being a transhumanist with a backache. Yes, of course we can fix it to some extent by the right biochemistry. And of course we might be able to fix the back eventually, but we are going to be having those struggles. And again, getting back to that issue of the mundane, how do you integrate it in everyday life? I'm signed up for Cryonics, which is kind of an interesting thing, because that brings in some of the weird future into everyday life, especially since I'm wearing this little tag visibly. So for those of you who don't know, cryonics is the idea that if current medicine can't save you, try freezing yourself so future medicine can maybe save you from what was ailing you and the freezing damage. And it's not a terribly popular form of immortality. It's been around for more than 40 years, and so far it's only about 200 people who are actually frozen. Maybe it's a total about 2,000 people signed up. If you compare that with even the most bizarre quack remedies against aging, you will find that they tend to be much more popular. And one of the reasons why it's not terribly popular is, of course, you need to plan ahead. You need to actually fill out a thick pile of forms in American legalese about the handling of your newly deceased body. That can put off most people. Indeed, a friend of mine who wanted to sign up, he put it off because his fear of death just got triggered every time he saw the forms of paper. And they contain a lot of details about what do we do if we can't save all of you? What do we do with the rest? That's kind of scary. You need to confront that and sign it in front of witnesses and send it off. And yes, you also need to pay for it by having a life insurance. So there is a fair bit of bureaucracy involved. So it's not like you just do this and forget about it and feel like, I'm going to be resurrected in the future, as Saint Kurzweil says. Now, I'm also taking this extra step of having this tag, which is normally just intended for the paramedics to notice that they need to treat you a bit differently on the outside, because that creates so many wonderful discussions and conversations. Medical professionals quite often raise a lot of eyebrows and start arguing, wait a minute, what about ischemia? And when I start rattling off things about cryoprotectants, we can get into a fun technical conversation. But there are also interesting issues about faith in the future. How much do you actually trust the future to handle you right? What about trust in technology, etc.? So I'm using this more like a transhumanist bling as an actual the immortality tool. But I'm rather unusual in actually doing this very overtly. Many of my colleagues who signed up in Oxford, they are of course quietly carrying it underneath because they don't want to look too weird. After all, it's a slight disadvantage being too eccentric unless you're a tenured professor. Once you're a tenured professor, you can allow yourself a certain degree of eccentricity and being outside the mainstream. But there are limits, and you want to spend your weirdness points in the right way. I have a terribly boring taste in clothing. I'm kind of conservative about that. But that's because I got this one already. I need to kind of balance that by dressing. So even my husband, the prosecutor, thinks, Anders, you could dress with a little bit more color.
Just a quick question.
Yeah.
Did you inspect the storage facility so that it had proper electrical backup and that kind of thing?
Yeah. So I actually happen to know the people involved in Alcor Life Extension. So very located in Scottsdale, Arizona, the most boring suburb of Phoenix you can imagine.
And one of the most expensive.
Yeah. It's really an interesting reason why they're there. Originally, of course, they're funded as an organization in California. But that's an exciting place on a continental plate boundary. And what's the likelihood of something going badly wrong in California compared to Scottsdale? Yeah, Scottsdale makes sense. Geologically stable, really boring, close to some industries, so you have a regular supply of liquid nitrogen. If you can't get liquid nitrogen, that means industrial civilization has fallen, and then you have bigger problems. But it also means that if I were to just keel over right now, it's unlikely that that would lead to a good suspension. The best case scenario would be that my doctor told me, Anders, I have some very bad news. I put my affairs in order, get a ticket over to Scottsdale, spend my last weeks at a hospice watching Republicans play golf outside, and that's going to hasten my demise a lot, and then I can get a proper suspension. But it's a very interesting thing, because how much do you trust an organization like this? So there are two other, Cryonics Institute is slightly older, and then there's Cryonics in Russia, which, I know the people involved, but I kind of trust Alcor more. I've been in the facilities, but yet, if I were to be stored there, generations might come and go. How much can we actually trust that organization? So they have been trying by studying organizations that are long-lived. One of the things is to try to make sure that the board of directors should all have relatives that are frozen, and ideally relatives we like. That can be a very important thing. You want to maintain some kind of generational continuity. They have actually undertaken some interesting looks on religious orders and other organizations that have been staying around for a long time. And that's also a relevant thing for some of my research about long-term futures. How long can organizations, civilizations and societies hang together and maintain their values? It might be that technically we can do things that vastly outstrip the amount of time our societies hang together. In any case, getting to the kind of flourishing part of transhumanism, I find it an interesting question, even how to define that, because if you just look at the Wikipedia definition of flourishing, it's all about kind of happiness. And I think that's a little bit too thin. Certainly there are a lot of transhumanists who want to be happy. David Pearce is a notable transhumanist who started out by looking at could we maximize our happiness using drugs or neuroscience so we could become super happy. And then he again had this interesting turn when he started thinking about it, when he realized actually maybe it's pain and suffering that's the real important part here. We might want to get rid of that first. It's an interesting question whether you could actually get rid of pain and suffering and just keep the happiness. So that's a profound philosophical and neuroscientific question, well worth investigating. But he's running both what he called the hedonistic imperative, trying to aim at this happiness, but also the abolitionist project. Can we remove pain and suffering first from ourselves, and once we figure that one out, of course we need to remove it maybe from all the other suffering beings in the biosphere, maybe elsewhere. So it leads to this interesting universalist realization, and also of course a deep interest in animal rights. But you can argue, of course, flourishing might not just be about happiness. It could be that you do something terribly meaningful but terribly boring. As Nozick's experience machine demonstrates, that maybe happiness is not all there is to life, and there might be some hard work that is actually really important to do, but nobody actually enjoys doing it. But maybe it needs to be done anyway. So there are these interesting questions about where do we get a sense of meaning. David would say actually sense of meaning, oh that's psychology, that with the right drugs you can get a sense of meaning. But on the wider sense, of course, the important stuff like getting rid of suffering is more profound than actually just smiling and feeling very happy. So there you get to essentially what has true value. And you typically notice this among many transhumanists, that they actually get quite interested in value theories. So Max Moore, who was very influential in the early 90s, he started the Extropy Institute, and now he's actually running Alcor, and he's actually the president. He wrote a very interesting article about self-creation as a virtue. So he was essentially trying to base transhumanism on a form of virtue ethics. And he pointed out that some of the most valuable things you can do is that you shape your life. And of course, Natasha likes to point out that life should be an art project. Again, it's an ongoing process, but you need to apply the right kind of judgment because you don't want to turn it a tacky art project. And creating yourself, okay, it's one thing to maybe get the discipline and change your habits and change your life, but it actually needs to hang together into some shape that makes sense. And figuring out what makes sense is, again, an ongoing process. When I look back at my earlier writings online or in philosophy, I'm getting rather embarrassed, and I'm rather happy for that. If I felt that they're just as brilliant as the thing I wrote yesterday, that would be a hint that I'm not developing at all. So this process is quite important. I think that is a relatively common transhumanist view, but yeah, there is this process of trying to improve yourself in a meaningful way, including figuring out better forms of meaning. And typically among the really flourishing transhumanists, I tend to see this. Eliezer Yudkowsky, for example, he stormed in on the Extropia mailing list in the late 90s as a teenager, and he was thinking that, oh, the world is a mess. It's horrible, all the things happening. We need to have a singularity now. Who's with me? And then he and his friends wanted to write an artificial intelligence that could improve itself and become better and better until it takes off in a singularity, and then we can fix all the problems of the world. A while after that, he started realizing that actually this superintelligence is starting to sound very much like God. It's actually starting to sound very much like the God of my fathers. As his name hints, he's coming from an Orthodox Jewish background. And he started to realize, actually, yeah, we are going to put in value systems in this artificial intelligence. The values we put in is going to be values of our human-made God. Uh-oh, if we put in the wrong values, we get something extremely nasty. So then he started thinking about what he first called friendly artificial intelligence. It's a bad name, because friendliness is not the same thing as niceness or anything else. But it was a starting point for realization that if we believe that we could make some tremendously powerful system, we have an enormous ethical and security obligation to make sure it's right. But of course, the deeper you start thinking about this, the harder the problem becomes. Because it's not just put in the golden rule or Asimov's laws of robotics. You realize that, oh, I actually need to express human values really well. So indeed, Eliezer has written some interesting text, which he now regards as childish, about the complexity of human value. He has an essay about the theory of fun, where he's trying to formulate what makes for a flourishing life. And one of the main realizations was, oh, this is way harder than we expected. Oh, those philosophers actually had something to say about this. So the project has continued and broadened and deepened in various ways. But one of the key realizations is that the real challenge of making safe superintelligence is that human values are complex and fragile. If you try to put in all the human values in the machine and leave out a few things, you might find that that actually crashes the whole story. And then you realize you need to make a machine that somehow can learn by observing us. And that turns out to be also profoundly hard, because it's by definition intended to be something pretty alien to us. So actually solving these problems are both an interesting technical and philosophical problem that keeps people rather busy. And of course, so all the news coming out of Google DeepMind suggests we might have a clock ticking. It might not be ticking that fast. It might still take a long while. But we better have figured this out before we get too powerful machines anyway. And even if one thinks that superintelligence is a pipe dream, you might still want to figure out how to make the cars or cleaning bots or decision-making systems that you use in the economy to at least have some understanding of the relevant aspects of human value. So there again, you get this interesting thing that you start out with a relatively naive idea about control and power. And then as it matures, you actually realize, oh, this is more complicated. But you still get a drive to actually fix it, because the transhumanists think that this is actually doable. It's not just a nice metaphor. You could be treating this as a metaphor and say, this is a great excuse for us to reflect on ourselves in the mirror of artificial intelligence. But on the other hand, there is a good reason to think that in a few decades, we're probably going to have devices that can outthink us in some or all domains. And at that point, we really want to have looked at ourselves well enough in the mirror to make somewhat livable systems. I don't know how I'm doing for time here, because I want to open up for more questions too, because I think we can do quite a bit of conversation.
Your internal time clock is impeccable. It's 2:45.
Wow. Yeah, I wish I could say, oh, yeah. At one point in time, I was actually trying to train myself to estimate time deliberately. I don't think that it really worked, but I do think that human time sense is pretty amazing on its own. I think most of you have had this experience of waking up a second before your alarm clock. We can do that. We can memorize enormous amount of it, even kind of without doing anything too fancy. We can do quite a bit. This is why I also think that with some help we can do even more impressive things.